The New York Times has come under scrutiny, including on this show, for publishing a story on the horrific Hamas attacks in Israel on October 7th, but paying particular attention to alleged mass rape. The in-depth report, titled Scream Without Words: How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th, has been the subject of internal and external criticism, not just for one of the writer's social media presences, but most notably the validity of allegations made by sources. According to The Intercept, the Times morning podcast, The Daily, planned to run a segment on the piece, but ultimately nixed it because they were unable to fully fact-check the article.
Here to do a deep dive on how the New York Times botched this report is Steve Krakauer, journalist and author of Uncovered: How the Media Got Cozy with Power, Abandoned Its Principles, and Lost the People. Welcome, Steve.
Hey, great to be back on with you.
All right, so let's just start out by reminding the audience how this story got botched in the first place. Can you give us a sense of what the scale of the initial New York Times reporting was and what we've learned since then?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there was certainly a botching of sorts, although I think that we will maybe disagree on the scale here. The New York Times published a very provocative, very explosive piece, and has since done a follow-up piece to it that alleged, as you kind of mentioned in the headline, this idea of weaponizing sexual violence, this idea of a systematic mass rape that occurred on October 7th with Hamas. And so this is something that was reported out by three reporters, two of which in particular have gotten the ire of the critics of the New York Times here, one of which, who is an extremely credentialed Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Jeffrey Gettleman. And there was a series of criticisms of this piece, and it was looked at by a variety of outlets that I think have a certain point of view related to it. But I also think that I'm someone who, if you look at Uncovered, my book, I go deep into different stories related to the New York Times. I'm not one to defend the New York Times, but I actually think that there's a nuance here. I'd love to get into it. That's why I love this show. But I think that it's a little bit more complicated than just the criticisms, particularly of the Intercept piece that has raised big questions about sourcing, questions about the key source, continuing the initial source that's in that piece. But I also think that there's more to the story as well.
It looks like, though, one of the main authors, you mentioned Jeffrey Gettleman, but also that they were relying on this freelancer who'd actually had very little previous journalistic experience, who was making these very, as you say, provocative claims. This is this was a major story. This really set the tone for the coverage of what was happening on October 7th. And some factual assertions have come to light, including one of the victims' families, publicly disputing how that issue was how they framed what had happened to their daughter, and on and on and on. So what are we to make of that? Do you think the Times is having any? We hear about internal strife over this story. Shouldn't they probably properly investigate what went into this so they could produce an article that said, okay, well, here are the facts that we straightened out. Here's what we think we can defend. Here's what maybe we actually can't defend, and should have softened the headline we went with.
Well, perhaps, and there has been some of that. Even a month later, this was now going back to late January, there was a follow-up piece done because of some of the internal strife you talk about and the external ones that have come about. I think that the reason this is coming to light is because this is such a hot issue right now in newsrooms. The issue of Israel and Gaza and Hamas has become a one that is across the media spectrum and across really the political spectrum, as we see kind of internally on the Democratic Party and elsewhere. This is one that is going to draw extra scrutiny. The New York Times is being attacked for being too pro-Israel in certain instances, like perhaps in this one, and being too anti-Israel by other quarters. And so this is one that's going to draw massive amounts of scrutiny. But I think it's an interesting point, though, about this reporter that liked a couple tweets on October 7th, 8th, and 9th, and is getting criticized for that. The idea that we need to have extremely credentialed people on the ground doing reporting, I think, is one that we all agree would be false. I think that to be a great journalist, you have to be curious, to be interested. I don't think we need necessarily to have massive amounts of degrees and awards that they've won. But they also do have that with Jeffrey Gettleman, who's also bylined on the piece. New York Times has a serious review process, editing process. So I think the idea that there may have been some false elements to this story may be true, just like there were false elements to the stories when they reported that an Israeli strike had killed hundreds, and they were forced to correct that record back related to the hospital story last year. So I think that the New York Times draws an extreme amount of scrutiny, but I don't think that this is a case of systematic pro-Israel related issues within the New York Times. In fact, just the opposite. I think that a lot of this is coming out because of certain points of view of a media criticism industry that is looking for stories like this.
So just so for context and those who haven't watched our earlier reporting on this, one of the tweets that Schwartz liked said that Israel needed to turn the Gaza Strip into a slaughterhouse. Another post said, those in front of us are human animals who do not hesitate to violate minimum rules. And so I think one of the questions people are asking is if there were a journalist who had liked tweets referring to Israelis or Jewish people as human animals, or saying that we needed to turn Israel into a slaughterhouse, would they still be hired by the New York Times, especially when they didn't have much in the way of journalism experience to begin with? Also, what is it, her nephew that was the other author that was hired on this piece? And moreover, I want to get to this question that you just raised about whether or not there's just bias that goes both ways here at the New York Times, because the question isn't whether or not there was an error that was corrected, as with the hospital bombing story, but whether or not following the, first, whether the reporting actually had anything affirmative to make the case about sexual assault allegations in the first place. So one of the issues that the Intercept reporting uncovered was that Schwartz had reached out to these rape crisis centers in Israel, had been told that there wasn't any evidence that they could provide her that these rapes had taken place. That information wasn't reported in the story, and the absence of evidence was taken to stand in for this accusation, this pretty serious accusation, that there was a widespread weaponization of sexual assault that was intentionally done by Hamas on October 7th. So, speak to me. You're saying that there's more nuance in this story, and you seem to be implying that the Intercept, the Gray Zone, and Frittata, the outlets that really led with uncovering the story have their own bias here. Do you really think that these are equivalencies?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And Briahna, I want to say this is why I love this show. I think you and I will strongly disagree on this topic, and I think that's fine. A couple points here. First of all, that rape crisis center element of the Intercept's reporting they have actually now come out and said there was sexual assault. I think one of the biggest problems here is this idea of systemic violence, or that it was this coordinated effort. That bigger picture has really obscured the reality of the idea that there was any sexual assault that took place by Hamas against Israelis that day. I think that it is absolutely absurd to say that is completely not true, that did not happen.
But that's not the argument, though, Steve, right? No one's saying
exactly.
that you can't prove the negative, that there was no sexual assault. But the specific allegation from the New York Times was that it was systemic and widespread, right?
Sure.
That it was an intentional part of the war effort here, right?
And I think that that's where we get into this fuzzy area, and where I think that there is legitimate reason to question the framing of that initial story, particularly the headline, as Robbie read. So, but I also think that what we have here is, as some of these outlets you mentioned, The Intercept, Gray Zone, Mondo Weiss, these are outlets that are have a point of view, have a conclusion, and are in search of facts and in search of evidence of that. And so I absolutely think that it is fair to say that these. I'm not assigning sort of the terms that I believe are conversation enders to this when it comes to Israel or Jews worldwide, but I do think that there is absolutely a point of view when it comes to this. I mean, the Intercept actually quoted October 7th fact check as an independent outlet. I mean, it's very clear where the October 7th fact check website comes about. It's very much a pro-Palestinian, very much from a very clear point of view. So it's completely false to say that this is just independent, trying to get down to the objective situation here. So I do think that that's the case. Now, I think that we are painting with too broad a brush to say that this story has the sort of holes in it that require a full-scale look at the New York Times as an organization that needs to be, that is somehow irrationally pro-Israel. In the Intercept reporting, I found this incredible piece where there was a person who was, in theory, pushed aside because he dared to say that describing Hamas as a terrorist organization was going too far. I think that it's absolutely absurd to say that we can't describe Hamas as a terrorist organization. So that as some sort of evidence of this pushback within the New York Times that's somehow pro-Israel is, again, going too far.
Well,
so I think
to clarify on that point for people who aren't aware, so the reporting was that the New York Times' own internal standards was to not refer to Hamas as a terrorist organization, as the government and municipal leader of Gaza. That has been the long-standing standard of the paper for years and years prior to October 7th. And the question was whether or not the person at the New York Times who was in charge of administering those standards should be pushed out because in the new political context after October 7th and the heated personal feelings around October 7th, whether those editorial judgments should be changed to meet kind of the emotional moment as opposed to remain journalistically consistent.
I mean, would it be emotional to change its designation after it commits a terrorist attack to terrorist organization?
First of all,
we know who
behavior.
We know who was behind October 7th, right? I mean, it was Hamas. So now, if you want to say there's a distinction
Hamas has been part behind attacks like this for a very long time, and the editorial standards still stand. So the question is, I just want to be really clear that the status quo of the New York Times, a paper that is rarely, if ever, accused of being pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinian, was to not refer to Hamas in that way. And so the movement there, the bias was in a different direction of the status quo that was established already at the New York Times, just to be clear about the posture of that reporting.
I think we've got to let you go, but we'll give you the last word.
I just want to say, there's also pushback from the New York Times about whether this person was actually pushed out over that. I think that this is a very complicated issue. I will say, in my book Uncovered, I get into the New York Times. The New York Times is a major corporate media, legacy media outlet that has tremendous power. I believe their power is eroding, but is this great microcosm for these sorts of debates. And I do think that it's important to have discussions like this about the New York Times and about the media at large, because it's an important industry. And it's important, particularly about this particular issue, it's important to kind of draw the lines of what is ethical in journalism when it comes to the American media when covering these issues that are really complicated.
The book is Uncovered. Steve Krakauer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.